Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. Here I'm bringing you the second half of my conversation with Dr. Aaron Balick. We spoke on November 13th, 2015. If you'd like to read a full transcript of this conversation, you can check the link down below in the description, and also down there you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue with this project. Thanks.
So, I mean, which is the new public self? Is it us online or is it us offline still?
Well, see, did you say public self or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So can I throw some jargon at you for a second?
I would love that. Yeah.
Okay. So technically, the technical job of the ego is it's an internal and an external job. So the ego functions to assess what's going on in your internal world and then to make appropriate choices about what to do in the external world. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So it has to be, well, it doesn't have to be because lots of them aren't, but it has to be relatively socially compliant. Yeah? So,
yeah.
You know, if you want a job, you got to go to your interview and maybe be a lot more polite than you would be in your regular life, because you may be really angry at the person who's interviewing you, but the ego recognizes your anger, rightfully kind of suppresses it, puts on a smile, and does the best it can to get you through the interview. Yeah? Mm-hmm, that's what your ego does. What happens online is, because it's pretty much a digital public space, is it invites that outward-facing part of the ego much more than the inward-facing part. Mm-hmm. And the consequence of that is that your ego starts to lean outwards and it starts to inflate that outward part. So what that looks like in the real world is if you're online all the time, what you're doing is, and you're extending yourself through the tool of whatever online mediation you're using, most of those tools, not all of them, but most of them invite expressions of the outward-facing part of your ego. Mm-hmm. So the consequence of that is that the inward-facing part of the ego isn't getting so much airtime, which can have some consequences. Now, we all need to have a persona in the external world. We wouldn't want to expose our most vulnerable or shameful parts all the time, everywhere. Mm-hmm. But because the public environment is now in our pockets through our smartphones, and it's the first thing we wake up to in the morning, and the first thing we go to bed to, or the last thing we go to bed to at night,
right.
My sense is that we're beginning to identify more and more with the outward part of our ego and forgetting more and more about the inward part. Yeah,
I would agree.
Because if you can feel it, can't you? You kind of know, you know when you're walking down the street and you think that's Instagrammable or tweetable, or it becomes a show quickly,
Yeah, I mean, I'm very unusual in the way that I use it, where I tend not to broadcast like a lot of personal things. Sometimes I do, but I mean, I'm an unusual user in that sense, where I sort of understand, like, you can't really glean a ton about someone online. Like, you really need to spend a lot more time with them. Obviously, clearly, I asked if I could call you and we could talk for about an hour or so. Like, that's still my preferred method of trying to understand things and the way other people see things. But
well, see, I think that's smart. And what you're saying is you're making choices about how you want to engage with different kinds of people in different ways. And I think if everybody did that. See, I think the problem is, so use Facebook as an example, and maybe you could educate me about the more social aspects of gaming in here. But Facebook is really great for secondary and tertiary relationships. Like, I don't want to be any closer to some of the friends I had in high school than I am on Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's fine. It's fine to find out what they're doing 2 or 3 times a year, or see what they're it's fine. I don't want that for my partner. I don't want to keep up with what my partner is doing on Facebook, or the close friend down the street that I'd rather have around for dinner.
Yeah.
And it's when you stop making those choices, and when you think, okay, well, Facebook tells me it's their birthday, so happy birthday, rather than actually this is a first level close tie friend whose birthday I should know it is, and maybe I should plan something to be with them. You see what I'm saying? Like, you have to make... And as soon as you stop doing that, it means you start looking for deeper relationships across networks that aren't really amenable to doing the job.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for that through your gaming or through your Twitter or through your Facebook, you're going to end up disappointed and hurt. Which isn't to say those relationships aren't real. They are real. It's just whether they can do the job of a real primary relationship.
Yeah. And, sometimes you do hear, or I do hear, I don't know if I'm sure you have, media can sort of push the idea of social media or the social media generation, whatever you want to consider that, because everyone's on social media now. Not everyone, but you know what I mean. A lot of age groups and types of people. But, it's sort of described as narcissistic, which is a word, obviously, that carries a lot of weight and will likely mean something different to you and your circles than to me and mine.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about the use of that term around social media?
I just wrote a blog post about this today.
Exactly. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't seen it yet.
No, I haven't put it out. But, it's for someone else. But
okay.
But it's fresh in my head. So but what it was called is self-centered or self-concerned, and I think social media is much more about self-concern than it is about self-centeredness, and or even self-referentialism.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between your understanding of narcissism and mine is the colloquial understanding is arrogant, self-interested, self-centered. The psychoanalytic understanding is almost exactly the opposite, that it's a show in response to a lack of a good enough sense of self. So it always emerges from a wound. Broadly, I mean, it's not very technical, but broadly a wound of self-esteem or self-confidence, but sort of goes more profoundly than that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I always say is, you're narcissistic long before you show up on social media. Like, if you're narcissistically oriented, that happens in very early childhood for the most part. And so social media will enable you to express that narcissism. However, as I said before, because it enables you to express your outward-facing part of the ego, that's kind of the location par excellence of a narcissistic way of being. So, of course, it's going to be easier to express that part, but I don't think it causes it. I think it causes an overwrought attention to how one is showing up. But I wouldn't say it sort of caused narcissism.
Yeah, I don't think it causes it, although it certainly it provides a variety of outlets for it that simply were not available before. And so I don't know, like I feel like sometimes with my friends or other people who I know through the internet, the very non-PC question they would want me to ask you is, why is everybody crazy? And I don't know if I can even ask you that question without A, like possibly offending you, or B, like, do you get a sense of that from your internet as well?
But see, I think everybody's crazy anyway. Like, and I'm not excluding myself. People are enormously complex, crazy things. It's crazy. I mean, look at it's crazy that we exist and that we know that we're going to die and that we've created this world where we work from 9 to 5 and we have religion and it's just crazy.
Yeah, you might have heard I did not disagree with you.
So I think what happens is you just get to see it all, and you get to see more and more and more of it. So it becomes concretized more so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think I was just talking to a friend of mine yesterday about how I was going to be talking with you, and his question was about people like who say they have body issues, but then they do tons and tons of selfies of them, like in just like a corset or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of guessed, my uneducated guess of like a little bit of what you said of sort of like seeking approval or just trying to throw something out there to get a sense that like people will think that they are normal. But then there's like another interview I did where I talked to a guy who was a business developer for Microsoft, and he worked on the. Do you remember the Microsoft Flight Simulator? Like
yeah, absolutely. I love. Yeah.
So he told me, oh, that's great. So then maybe you'll have some more insight on this. He told me that people, this is like Web 2.0 internet, pre-Twitter, pre-social media, late 90s internet, when people of their own volition would create digital airlines, meaning someone would be recruiting and managing people who would be flying digital airplanes on real-time flights from, say, where you are right now to San Francisco.
Sure.
And so, obviously, this is an outlet that did not exist before, where you could pretend to be in an airline and then do an 8-hour flight sitting at your computer. And this is an incredibly broad question, but, I mean, what were people doing before these sorts of outlets were available? I'm sure they weren't sitting around wishing they could be doing specifically that, right?
No, but they were certainly reading fiction and going to the movies and playing Dungeons and Dragons, and people have an active imaginary life, and I think that's really healthy.
Yeah.
In fact, I think something I wanted to say before we finish, which is related to this, which is kind of, I don't know, my mental health sort of thing, is that the most important thing that we need as human beings, and the most important thing that we can do for each other, is to authentically recognize and mutually understand each other as best we can. Yeah. So like I really want you to understand where I'm coming from, and I want to understand where you're coming from, and if there's a difference there, that we can kind of work it out and see how we're different. And what's something like what you've just described, the flight simulator thing, or Second Life, for example, or
which to be clear, I'm not at all mocking. I'm curious, like before people could do that, like what were they doing?
They do, and and now again we have this concretization that we didn't have before. So not only can you try to recognize me and understand me from my ideas about psychology, but if we were in a gaming world, then there could be a mutual recognition of all sorts of aspects of my imagination that I can't actualize in the real world. Yeah, so I can look different. I can have an avatar. I can engage with others in a way that I don't in my waking social life. Yeah. So you could see that as an expansion of recognition as well. That there's a possibility that you can actually actualize even further because you can concretize your imagination in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to be clear that I wasn't mocking it, but I think very easily, someone reading a transcript of this could think that is, stupid or crazy or insane or silly. And
what, the flight simulator thing?
Yeah, I mean, but I think people would say that also about Dungeons and Dragons or going to college or, you know what I mean? Like, it's all subjective.
Yeah, I mean, look. to use an old cliche, different strokes for different folks.
Exactly.
We have a tradition in this country. I think they do it in the States too. Of standing around train stations with notepads and knowing train spotting. Knowing which train comes in and what's going out. Lots of people don't understand that, but other train spotters understand that, and that's what makes it a social act. So a lot of the acts that we think are antisocial, or that people think are antisocial, like Minecraft, for example, or gaming is often seen that way by people who don't know it. It's because they don't know, they haven't tried to understand the social draw. And I think there always is. I think there always is a social draw.
Mm-hmm. So I just have a couple more questions for you here. But, okay. I mean, what do you notice about the mentality of the ways people or companies combat harassment online? Like, what seems to go into the thinking of the quote unquote best way to solve for it?
Yeah, it's funny. I think you go one way or the other, don't you? You have the look, I just want to take my hands off and say this is free speech and it's the free internet and I don't want to intervene in any kind of a way. Yeah. And then you have the other side, which wants to make it safe and wants to make it really safe.
Yeah.
I kind of usually come at it from a different angle. Like, I think we can't make it safe any more than we can make schools safe or inner cities safe. You can try all sorts of things, but something's going to happen somewhere along the way. So what you really have to do is teach resilience. If you have a Twitter following of 10,000 people, they're not all going to like you. Yeah. And same thing in the gaming world, same thing wherever your audience can be large. So as an extension of self, I think, again, you use the laws that are around. If somebody's making a threat online, it's a threat. If someone's insulting you online, it helps to know it's easier to be insulted online, and that you should take it less personally.
So, I mean, you got on my radar from that BBC program about fan armies and One Direction, and I think it's understood, at least by people reading the site and by a lot of people, clearly, given the nature of the program. But fanhood is important to people, and Gamergate is sort of like a strange mix of fanhood and like a misfiring immune system is sometimes the way that I think about it. But one of the reasons I did start this project as well is just I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the game companies, all the game companies who have created this culture of fanhood had zero reaction to its audience sort of eating itself and trying to threaten itself. And so, I'm curious, obviously I'm trying to rail against some of that silence from the industry and try to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
But how does that silence, impact the mentality of an audience? How can that be perceived by people within the crosshairs and outside of them?
Yeah, I mean, you can see why intense fanhood would be encouraged, because the more intense the fanhood, the more invested one is in that game as an identity. Yeah, so you can see the commercial advantage of that.
Right.
The hands-off, and I don't know the details of the hands-off in relation to Gamergate, but the hands-off, I think from the outside at least, can be perceived as neglectful. And this is how trolling was perceived through a number of events on Twitter, where Twitter wasn't taking responsibility for what was going on its platform, when it was becoming threatening. And I do think, like I said before, that any online environment develops a culture of its own. And part of that is going to happen not necessarily randomly, but, in its own organic kind of a way. But the people who run those platforms, the developers, have quite a lot of power. And I think that power can be used to encourage respectful cultures rather than disrespectful ones.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, my working... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
My working theory, and the great thing about being able to talk to you now as opposed to 11 months ago when I started, is I have... Because I told you, the culture is, it's very difficult to... The corporate culture is, it's very difficult to... I can't ask these questions of most people at a game company. I have been able to get some who are between contracts, or people who don't care anymore, people who... I was just transcribing this interview I did with a writer who has worked on the Call of Duty games. And he told me, and some other people have told me who have worked on Grand Theft Auto, the interesting thing that I've learned is that the workplace didn't feel like... this is one of the strangest things I've learned in the course of this. They told me that the workplace didn't feel like the right place to talk about this stuff.
Right.
So there was no conversation about this.
You're making me really curious about about it all.
I'm doing a good job. Well, I mean, this is the thing that has vexed me and why I started. And I'm just stunned I was able to get this out of people, and B, what do you mean it didn't feel like the place to talk about it?
I mean, I'd be really curious about that, because what you're describing is a culture of something that you haven't been able to put your finger on. That you send somebody in an organizational psychologist who can just sit and absorb what's going on and come to some kind of conclusion about what's being said or what's not being said, you might find some very interesting conclusions. I have no idea what they would be, but one of my guesses is that the development of games is like the development of any artistic endeavor, like a film or a book or something like that, which requires a lot of a ton of emotional investment, because it's about your creative expression also. But it's also a team effort, like a film, with different developers with different skills doing different jobs, and probably with people with different visions and different ideas that can invite all kinds of tensions. Perhaps in an environment where it's not so safe to be explicit about those tensions. Which isn't different from a lot of workplaces, actually, but this particular workplace has those challenges. And there might be a culture of fear too, from games.
I mean, what I was going to say, and I've written a little about, and sort of why I decided to do this was, I was trying to figure out, just like, I felt like I saw a lot of writers explaining about things that they couldn't possibly know about because these people at these companies are just not allowed to talk. And so, one of my conclusions after 130 some interviews in 11 months so far is like, I've been busy.
Yeah.
I can tell you a little bit more about my ambitions for this, but like, it feels like to me like the industry is afraid of the audience it created. And they're kind of stuck in a way because they don't want to offend the really... it's not that simple that it's just the passionate people making threats and the people in the crosshairs, but you run the risk of alienating people no matter what you do.
And you know the answer to this much more than I do, but the scale of the numbers of people that must be deeply involved in how these things develop must be huge.
Well, I mean, not only that, but like the people who make them. So like as they become bigger entities to create, they're more difficult to be nimble. But then the audience grows, and then it's it's calcified, I guess. Is that a word?
Yeah. Well, I think that is a word, and I think psychologically at least, whenever you move towards rigidity, it always gets more difficult because things do calcify, which means they can't bend, which means they can't be nimble, as you say, and respond to changes. People want it to be the same, and that's why you get a sudden break, instead of a gradual change. That's, like I said, I don't know a lot about Gamergate, but I'm sure if you went to before, during, and after and did kind of a critical psychodynamic analysis, you'd see lots of instances of ossification and rigidification and splitting until it reached this sort of crisis point.
Well, I think in a way too, it's sort of it's a stemming, or it branches under like just a lot of the non-communication, and it's as far as just companies commenting or being able to interact with an audience beyond marketing.
And dialogue tends to happen, it tends to happen across social networks as well. And as we were talking about before, the nature of complexity, it's just not the best way. If your industry is digital and your communications are digital and asynchronous, you're not starting from a very solid foundation for being able to negotiate complex difference. You see what I mean? It kind of put it at a disadvantage, because somebody can take to the airwaves very quickly and, like a Rush Limbaugh style of just, out of context decimation for the end goal of that,
I sometimes invoke Donald Trump's name, but Rush Limbaugh as well is fairly apt. So one of the last things I want to ask you, and I have like two more for you, is are you familiar with the account Very Old Tweets? At Very Old Tweets?
No, I'm not.
I'm sure you can figure out what it is from the name. But so it's a bot that tweets things from the first 90 days of Twitter in seemingly random fashion. But clearly we've come a long way. The culture has changed so much. Where I think what people used to say is like, they don't really care what other people are eating. don't need to see what people are eating on social media now, as people don't really need to hear what everyone has to say. But the thing that strikes me about this account is, like, these are just some random examples I plucked out. It's like, this is a tweet. It's just in lowercase, want a massage, or dinner, ... roast beef, peas and carrots, rice and gravy. I'm ready to use a new software at work. Nice, but I still see some old problems. I mean,
riveting stuff.
It's truly gripping, and the pathos is so apparent. But what changed where we went from that to the sort of stuff that we're talking about now? Is it merely just adoption and the platform got flooded and got normalized, or? Well,
again, first let me commend you for your questions, because you're asking some really interesting questions.
Thank you.
No, really.
That's why I wrote you. I was like, it's not really just about video games.
Yeah.
It's going to seem like it is, but I swear it's about a lot more than that.
You're plugging into a lot of, I think, really interesting and important issues, and I hadn't thought about that in relation to Twitter. I was probably relatively late adopter.
I started in about 2009, and only because I had to for work.
Right. Yeah, and I had to for my book. I love it, actually. I really like Twitter a lot, but I
like parts of it.
Yeah, okay. I get that too.
Yeah.
I think what you see is the development of a culture. So again, it'll develop in a way that maybe the people who build it don't necessarily expect. And I think maybe with very old tweets, it hasn't developed that culture yet. So it's marketed originally as a microblogging site. And, back at the time, blogs were often, diary entries, for not very many people, under 140 characters. So I think what happens is you build an environment. It's like you can build a park, and if you put, if you put trees in it, something's going to happen. But if you put sliding boards and swings in it, something different's going to happen. So they put these certain variables into place, and people start using it, and then over time, it develops a culture that's amenable to that. Yeah, so now the culture is, it's kind of a hashtag-based trending culture. And that started, again, kind of randomly, but now it's manipulated. So same thing with Google. Google creates a search engine, which is an environment, which starts to happen randomly, and then people start to manipulate the system to get the best out of it, which then Google kind of shifts again, and then it develops a culture.
So it's not like we are getting angrier or we're changing. It's just there's an outlet for it that wasn't there before, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm actually proposing that, but obviously something changed.
I don't think we're getting angry. I think we're exposed. I don't think we're getting angrier. I think we are exposed to more of it, and I think because we see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wish it weren't. I wish there were social media that enabled a deeper kind of engagement that promoted more complexity. Because the trouble with the lack of complexity is you do get Donald Trump solutions, and they're I'm sorry if I'm going to offend the Donald Trump supporters, but they're just they're not really helpful for anyone.
It's okay. I think you can offend some people.
Yeah.
That's like another thing too that like I've seen with the internet too is sometimes like the notion of people being like, you know what, you offend me as a bigot, and I feel like okay, but maybe you could be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that like you are actually being racist, or you are actually being this, or you are actually being that. Like it's very. I don't know. I feel like I've seen notions of that sort of go away. That like, you know what? Like some people are actually just wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And unfortunately, it's very easy to paint somebody wrong. It's a very it's an ad hominem attack.
Right.
Which means I can dismiss what you're saying because I'm painting you as a racist.
Correct.
And again, the medium enables that to happen. Whereas if you're having a conversation, or if there's some history there, you might say, "Look, I'm not a racist, but this is how I feel about so and so." So it's got, it enables certain kinds of communication and it disables other kinds of communication. And for some things that can be good, and for other things it can be really terrible.
Yeah.
It is a tool.
Well, so the second to last thing I'll ask you is, what confounds you about the internet or social media? What scratches your brain the way that clearly some things scratch my brain?
Yeah.
Because these may not be your pet topics. I don't know.
Well, I mean, my pet topics are really about what motivates people to do what they do, and all of their and our craziness.
Yeah, I can relate.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I suppose it's why we continue to do things that aren't particularly good for us. So why it's something as simple as checking your emails after hours when even. You probably don't even want the emails that are coming, but you still check. Like none of those emails are going to make you happy that you're looking at just before you go to bed.
Yeah.
And yet we do it. You put something on Facebook that's offended some people, and people start talking, and you think you should not talk about that on Facebook anymore because that always happens. And then you do it anyway, and then you look. And then you keep looking as it builds, and you get more and more upset, and you keep going back. Yeah, it's this repetition compulsion.
Is it actually addiction? I mean, you hear that word thrown around a lot too, and I know that also means something different to your circles than mine.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of debate about it. I think there are addictive components because I think it's the nature of novelty. I mean, that's why we look at our emails even though we don't want them. It's the kind of the random bing that alerts us that something new's coming in, and it has to do with us, so I must look. So, yeah, I mean, they do say that there is some evidence that there are some addictive qualities to a lot of the things we do on the internet, and I think that is concerning. I think we do have to make better choices for ourselves, and I include myself in that. I do now put my phone away an hour before I go to bed. That's like my latest concession. But we have to be mindful. We make, I think Sherry Turkle said it, we get technology that we want, but not necessarily technology that we need. So I often make the metaphor to fast food. Fast food has everything that we love in it. And you can get it really cheaply and really easily, and you can have it all the time if you wanted it, but it's actually not very good for you.
Oh, there was a comedian, I forget who it is, but it's probably Jim Gaffigan, but he has a line about, like, when you're a kid, every time you have fast food, it's a victory, but as an adult, every time you have fast food, it's a defeat.
Right. Wow, that's really right on the money, isn't it?
So this will be my last question for you, and it's very intentionally broad. And normally I like to ask people, what they feel video games have accomplished, and that is not your area of focus, and I feel that would be unfair to ask you. So this is perhaps much more profound, which is, what do you feel, digital communication has accomplished or achieved for us? Because it used to not exist.
Yeah, it really did. Yeah, it was funny. I was looking at an old Air France map the other day, and they had the flight from Paris to New York, which stopped in Shannon in Ireland, and then stopped in Newfoundland, and then stopped again, like in Maine, and then stopped again in New York, and it took, 20 hours or something like that. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of notion of the shrinking world, which we've done in some ways physically, because we can get to New York now in 6 hours. But we have access to information and people in ways that we never, ever had. So, we are having this conversation because you heard a radio broadcast. I don't even know where you live. Where do you live?
I'm in the Chicago area, but honestly, the only reason I heard about that is because someone I interviewed told me about it.
Right.
She did not mention you specifically, but I heard you and your title, and I was like, oh, I have to talk to this guy.
Cool.
Because he's like me, but he probably knows what he's talking about with this stuff.
Yeah, well, see this, and look what's happened. Yeah, so there's this one bit of media that only happened over here that this woman told you about through your shared interest over Skype, and then we get to share an interest over Skype, and I think that's incredible. Like, I think it's great, and actually, you know, a lot of the closest associates I have in my life, I never would have encountered or had the opportunity to share ideas with if it weren't for the kind of digital infrastructure we have these days. Mm-hmm. And I go by that Kranzberg motto a lot. You know, I don't know if you know it. The technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think
it just is.
It just is. But the way in which the architecture functions makes it not neutral. Yeah, so we're having a conversation, but we wouldn't happen to be looking at each other at this moment. So, you know, this is a sound conversation that's going to be turned into a transcript. And then that transcript is going to go online, and then somebody might see my name or your name and want to contact us to have a similar interest. And then that can grow. Unfortunately, the shadow side of that exists at the same time. You know, people can gang up to do some serious damage. But that is the nature of any tool. You know, a hammer can hammer in a nail, or it can hammer in somebody's head. It's what you decide to use with the tool, and it's always going to be thus. But it's a pretty remarkable tool, and I think for the most part, I'm pretty happy about it.
I'm getting there.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
Well, I mean, it's a really strange thing I'm investigating. It's a lot of really, you know, bleak things, and it's a labor force that feels like it doesn't have a voice, and it's an audience that doesn't feel heard, and it's supposed to be fun.
Yeah,
so
well,
there's a lot of disconnects happening.
Your inspiration for this project, you know, came from a kind of a breakdown, and I think the more we can learn about what initially, you know, what variables are in place that facilitate what you've just described, then you can incorporate that knowledge into further developments of things and create cultures, I think, that are more amenable to more humane undertakings.